So I have a hard stop, I'm told, although I'm not sure I'll be able to hit it. So we'll see how this goes. I probably put together enough material to give 6 separate hour-long talks, and I'm going to try to get through that in the next 40 minutes, so we'll see how this goes. He said I can introduce myself, but I'm not going to waste a bunch of time. I did some stuff before. This is the 3rd time I've spoken at a Velocity, but the first time since 2010. And I've been to every Velocity in the U.S. This is me on Twitter, little idea. It's my thing, whatever. So there's a certain philosophy that says that when you give a talk, that you should try to make one point really, really well. Fortunately for you, I don't actually belong to that school of thought. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go on a ride. I'm going to try to take you on a ride and try not to get hurt. Hopefully you guys all signed waivers at the door. I'm going to draw a bunch of dots, and I'm going to try to help you connect some of them, and maybe we can connect them, and maybe we can't, but they're there in the sky, definitely. So real fast, the past. I've been to every Velocity in the United States so far. Knock on wood. And so the first little bit, I'm going to actually give you some stuff from slides that I either gave at Velocities or other related conferences. So a long time ago, I used to have slides that looked like this. And I was talking about a tool called Puppet. And I'd say, you can either do this, dun, 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 or you can't. And at the time, I also had a slide that looked like this. It's a Venn diagram. And then I'd do this. Boom. And that was 2008. And now, 2013, this is a very different story, right? We have all this kind of, IBM and HP and Gartner and Forrester, they're talking about some DevOps. They usually mess it up, but they know the word. And we had a mission, we had a purpose. When we were talking early, even before it was called Puppet, we had this idea that you could change the way people thought about managing computers. And Puppet's a thing, and I'm not really involved with that project anymore, but it's had this big impact on a lot of other tools and philosophies in that space. And this is a thing that I used to talk about all the time, and a lot of people give me credit for saying this first or whatever. So infrastructure is code. It's let's manage it like code. I also did this thing. You guys might have seen that in other presentations. So there's these guys, and they make code, and then there's these other guys, and they receive it on the other side of this wall, and it's not always fun, and people are unhappy. And then, we tried, and with the guidance of people like John Allspaw and Patrick Dubois and other people in this audience, then we made some progress. So that's the past. But what I was always interested in was, and this is another slide I always used to use. Who knows what this is? It's a Gatling gun, and this changed warfare, right? When you could put this much metal down range that fast, changed warfare. So that's the forward. So now we're moving forward. What this talk is not about, it's not really about ops. It's not really about devs. It's not really about DevOps. And I'm not trying to convince you that talent is not necessary, and that talent's not desirable, and that talent is not an advantage. Because we're looking for advantages, because we want to crush people. But who's ever said this? Who's ever heard this? Who's ever said it? Whenever I hear people say this is what I think. It's I don't really get you. I don't understand. So let's define talent. What is talent? And this is dictionary definition. A special ability that allows someone to do something well. Easy. So let's assume talent exists. It's a thing. Fair? Is talent finite? Is this a zero-sum game? Can talent be attracted? Can talent be created? Can it be cultivated? Talent seeks talent. Who said this or heard someone say this sort of thing? Talented people want to work with talented people. No? John looks like he's in pain, but we'll come back. Who agrees that if you have an excess talent, then that's probably a competitive advantage? We'll talk later, John. We'll be all right. Who's ever heard this? Who says this? No, a lot of other people. So let's define culture. What does culture mean? There was a bunch of talks the first day in a kind of sister conference that was related to this topic. So this is, I think, the top, or the definition most people are using when they say culture in this kind of circle, and that is the sort of the way that we have these patterns of communication and interactions with each other in an organization. The way we think, the way we behave. And that's fair, but if you actually look at the root of the word culture, then it comes from the same root as cultivate. And it's much closer to the way that this word makes its way into the English language is this idea of developing individuals. When you say someone has culture, when they're cultured, it means that they've actually kind of developed maybe talents even. So that's the original use of the word. And I'm going to argue culture is strategy, right? Like we had a whole day of conference on this. So we talk about culture, and I got really sick, actually, of hearing a lot of culture talks where they're totally inactionable. Like there's nothing you can actually do. Everyone's like, culture is a weapon. And you're like, okay. Now what do I do? And then we also have, we talk about culture, and then you go out on the board, and there's like this buzzword list, right? Where it's like, oh, well, we're going to hire senior DevOps dudes or girls or whatever, and it's like a bullet list, bullet list, bullet list, bullet list, bullet list. It's like, so we reduce people to like these labels that we want to put on them. And we're talking about all these words sort of around culture, but we're not really talking about, at least what I'm seeing, at the core of it, this original meaning of the word. Are we actually cultivating individuals? Are we cultivating ourselves? And how many of our organizations, and I know there are some organizations that are, some of them are probably here, they're actually doing more and more deliberate experiments with their culture, with their management structures, with the way that they manage work, with the way that they interact with each other. But I think for the most part, there's sort of this command and control autocratic approach to management, Sloan School of Management, that's sort of been the dominant paradigm for a long time. And I'm going to argue that it's a competitive disadvantage, especially in knowledge work. Who's familiar with Conway's Law? So I basically accept this as a truism at this point, and this is the idea that you will build systems that mirror the communication structures, the communication efficiencies of the organization that you are. So if you have two groups that don't actually communicate very well, look at those APIs and how they talk to each other, and you can usually kind of map out the exact org. And it's not just a good idea, it's the law. So she gave a talk, I believe on Monday, and this is a quote from a talk she gave that's on YouTube that's amazing. And she used to be at Netflix, but I believe she might have left, but I could be wrong. I think she left, yeah. But she gave this amazing talk about Netflix when she was at Netflix, and she said that we're deliberately building this culture. And this is the thing, this was a huge epiphany for me when she said this. The real company values, as opposed to the nice-sounding values, are shown by who gets rewarded, promoted, or let go. When I hear that, I was like, culture, right? Who gets rewarded? Who gets promoted? Competitive advantage. So that's the prologue. Now we're going to get some real talk. Section 1, the game has changed. I never really thought of myself as a developer. I kind of like stumbled into computer stuff because people would pay me. I really wanted to do math, but I got paid to develop. And then I never really thought of myself as a sysadmin. I'm probably a poor sysadmin, but I could make some systems do some stuff. And I never really thought of myself as a manager, but like people paid me to do that too. So I did whatever I could for the companies that I was a part of, at whatever level, as an employee, as a founder, as a peer, at the level I was empowered. That's my personality. I know a lot of other people in this room probably have a similar personality. But what I really want, because I'm pretty competitive, I want to win. And I'm fascinated with the dynamics of performance and the dynamics of high-performing organizations. So when you have high-performing individuals, how do you get them together to work together? Because there's a lot of examples, especially from sports, where you get the most talented team and they suck. They suck because one guy won't pass the ball and there's all these weird ego battles, right? So how do you get them on the same page? How do you get them? Same thing with music, bands, where you have different people have different ideas and maybe they come together and there's this amazing creation and then they can't keep it together. It's an unstable formation. So there's this idea of mastery. Who knows what a scrum master is? That might be relevant to the next slide. Who knows who this is? Who's ever watched a UFC? So this is Fred Edish, and this is the first UFC. And Fred Edish is coming out, and they're reading his lineage. He's walking into the octagon, and they're talking about, I don't have it remembered, but it's 6 different belts or something, and 5th degree of this, and 7th degree of that, or whatever. Didn't really matter, because after a few minutes, this is what Fred Edish looked like. And he was none of his training had put him into a position where he could deal with physical combat. All of the mastery that he had accumulated was a result of being taught by masters, many of whom had never been in a fight at random strip malls across America. At the same time, who knows who this is? So this is Hoist Gracie, and if you look at their physical attributes, they're not identical, but they're comparable. And Hoist Gracie was renowned champion of the first UFCs. He won 3 of the first 4, and in one of them, he got injured. He won his fight by submission, and then he withdrew because he was injured. So he never lost, and he was beating men that outweighed him by 150 pounds often, and physically more powerful, sometimes more training, but he had a skill. He had been trained in a certain way. And that his outcome was very different than the outcome of Fred Edish, right? This is a picture from GM in the 1960s. And GM was a dominant manufacturer. I hear they're coming back. They might have some good cars. They're coming. Go USA. And the GM guys, they had this thing going, and they were this dominant thing. They had this paradigm. They were building cars, and it was good times. It was a good time to be an employee at GM. And according to the stories, the GM executives visited Japan in the 60s before the Japanese just-in-time delivery mechanisms essentially wreaked havoc on the American auto industry. And they saw these factories, and they could not believe that those were real factories. They saw the factories, and their mental model of how factories work and the inventory required to build cars made it such that when they saw factories with no inventory, they thought that the Japanese were putting on a pageant, putting on a show. It was all for our benefit. Those are not real factories. There's no way they can build cars, right? How can you do this deployment 50 times a day? That's crazy. So the game has changed, right? There's all these things, and most of you guys are probably using some of these every single day, right? These are tools that have changed the game. These are ideas that have changed the way people build infrastructure, build applications, operate things, work together, right? And then there's this thing, and I said it wasn't about DevOps, but I'm going to sprinkle some DevOps because I feel like I'm qualified to talk about DevOps a little bit. So everyone's talking about DevOps, right? So which part of the DevOps elephant are you touching? Because clearly we're all talking about different things, or often we're talking about different things. But definitely there's something going on. There's this change, there's this transition. The way that people are building applications, the way they're delivering applications, the way they're delivering business value has changed in the last 5 years. I think, in some sense, velocity is a part of that narrative, right? I feel like Velocity was the very first DevOps conference ever. And this is a Deming quote. Deming is not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. Deming. All right, gratuitous diversion. 1. So we'll go through this really fast. The game has changed. What does that actually mean? So the payoffs for a given strategy has changed, right? The payoffs for the strategy the GM employed changed out from under them. The strategy for whatever you do with the karate guy in the strip mall did not work against Hoist Gracie. So quick, superficial, hand-wavy introduction to game theory. So game theory is the study of mathematical models of conflict and cooperation between intelligent, rational decision makers. Right? So we're going to define a few more terms. Rational, what does that mean? It means in the context of the game and the information that you have, you are trying to maximize a utility function. And that could be as complicated as you don't want it to model, or it could be simple. Nash equilibrium, who's familiar with this? Who's seen A Beautiful Mind? So this guy got a Nobel Prize for this idea, and that is in a game where you have strategies and payoffs that you can calculate equilibrium points where no player will unilaterally change their strategy. And that's a fixed point in that game. At the point in time, and they're path dependent, so you can get to one Nash equilibrium, and you'll never get out of it, but there might be other Nash equilibriums that you can get into. Who's familiar with this idea? Pareto efficiency. So Pareto efficiency is when you're allocating resources, or I'm going to kind of drag it into game theory, like the payoffs, there's payoffs that would make someone. If it's Pareto efficient, there's no change of strategy that will make one player better and another player worse. If it's Pareto inefficient, then it's possible to make some party better and no other party worse, right? So I'm going to argue that a lot of the problems that people face in their organizations are Pareto inefficient Nash equilibriums. And that it is possible to make people better off in our organizations without making anyone else worse off. Like that we often come to loggerhead conflicts between two parties who, if they were able to, because of the way the game's been played, that's the Nash equilibrium that we're at. But there's probably some other Nash equilibrium that we could potentially get to that would be better for everyone involved. Or at least no worse for some parties. But no one will change. So it's possible to do this, but no one will actually change because you're at a Nash equilibrium. So by definition, they won't change unilaterally unless the actual payoffs change, right? So you have this external pressure to perform, to do all these other things. Like if your existential threat is outside the building, then you might be very motivated to change some things. And I wanted to add a little bit here because I tried to explain this before and people are like, well, I don't see how the Nash equilibrium is a solution. And it's like, it's not a solution, it's your problem. So one of the things you can actually, I think is useful if you start to think about these sort of things is if you can look at most of the people that you're dealing with as rational agents, even though we're provably not, then you can start to figure out what people are maximizing. What is the payoff of the strategy that this person is employing? If you're thinking about dev, you're thinking about ops, and I think this applies to basically all these other relationships in our little Conway-Lawed organizational structure that we're dealing with. All right, we'll come back to that. So section 2, the makers of learning. So I got to be in a position to see quite a bit of variety of different organizations. Some of that has to do with Puppet, some of it has to do with my personality, some of it has to do with Agile, some of it has to do with a bunch of stuff. I've probably seen close to, I don't know, almost 100 organizations like up close, and then by proxy more than that. And I try to pay attention. Like, I don't know, it's my wiring. So I've seen a bunch of this stuff. Applications, infrastructure, processes, DevOps cultures. I've seen people succeed, and I've seen my fair share of failure. Contributed some of those. It's a good way to learn. And I was frustrated after seeing some of these, and I heard at the last velocity in Santa Clara, Adam Jacob gave a talk about continuous delivery, and he had a section where he was talking about this idea where his experience, you could give the same tools and the same advice to two different organizations, and they would get drastically different. On face, they look like they were in very similar situations, but they would get very, very different outcomes. And one would say, that's the worst advice, that's the worst thing anyone's ever done for my organization, and another group would be like crushing it and like, onto the promised land. And what I came to realize after having gone into another, Fortune 100 company and trying to explain to them how to do DevOps and being told, is there some way we can do DevOps but not change anything? Is there some way you can help us do that? I recognize, or at least I believe, because we think we're pattern matchers, but often it's just our cognitive bias. So keep that, take it with a grain of salt. I believe that the success and failure is highly correlated with the degree of organizational learning. And that's something I'm going to define in a moment. How about the next slide? So it turns out there's this research from the 90s on organizational learning that's quite interesting. And the 7 dimensions of organizational learning are defined on the next slide. So I'm going to go through each of them. There's a quick list, but I have one slide with each one. So the first one is continuous learning. And it's basically this idea that each entity in an organization and the organization itself is continuously learning all the time, right? Continuous learning. Awesome. Inquiry and dialogue. So organizations' effort to create a culture of question, feedback, and experimentation. These sound familiar. Some of these things sound familiar. Seems like this is just an aside, like we tend to solve problems in humanity, and then we forget about them. And then we got to go dig them up again. So inquiry and dialogue. Team learning. So this is the idea that not just are you learning as individuals at all times, but you're also trying to build this collaboration of learning. And they measure that with some stuff we'll see in a minute. So empowerment. And this is the idea that regardless of rank, everyone in the organization is participating in this process of both learning and decision making. Embedded system. So the closest thing to the embedded system, the way they're defining it is anyone familiar with the shared metaphor ideas from extreme programming? No. So at a developer conference, maybe someone will raise their hand. But the idea is that you develop these models and these semantics, these jargon inside of your organization, so that when you have a discussion about the themababer or whatever, that you guys all wrote, whatever your little open source package is, that becomes sort of this central thing. And so when you say those words, that jargon, that has bigger meaning, right? So we can have these semantically dense things inside of our tribal unit as a team that we can't have if you go home, or even if you go to other ops teams, until they're using that project or until they're using that same model, then those words don't mean the same thing. So that's sort of what embedded system means. And then system connection is to the degree that we're actually connecting some of these efforts. So in a lot of organizations, you might have multiple dev teams, you might have multiple ops teams, you might have, because there's different parts of the system, and those services have to talk to each other. And to the extent, if we go back to Conway's law, how much of those are those services connecting, facilitated by the humans connecting? And then finally, strategic leadership. And that's to the extent to which leaders act strategically using learning to create change. Pretty simple, right? So what does that mean? How would we measure these dimensions? So these guys, Watkins and Marsick, and I've been talking to them and exchanging emails, and I've had a few phone calls, and I'm going to get them to come talk to a DevOps Days or Velocity or something in the next year or so. And they're both females that did a bunch of this research in the 90s, and they have this Dimensions of Learning Organizations questionnaire. You can find it online and take it. I'm going to show you some examples in a moment. The majority of the questionnaire is in the form of "in my organization," and you're going to give a rating, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 or whatever. So here's an example. In my organization, people openly discuss mistakes in order to learn from them. Have we ever heard ideas like this before? Let's hide them. That works out. In my organization, people identify skills they need for future work tasks. In my organization, people are encouraged to ask why, regardless of rank. In my organization, groups focus on the group's task and on how well the group is working. ... Has anyone ever had a retrospective? My organization builds alignment of visions across different levels and work groups. And this is from the 90s, and somehow we had to reinvent DevOps, right? But those are all questions. How powerful would it be if those were statements? And not just words, but they're actually incentivized. Because if they're not incentivized, they won't be real. Patty McCord, right? If that's what your real culture is, what do you reward? Gratuitous diversion 2. So this is another thing that you hear people say. It's like, okay, we can't do that. Doesn't work. It's like, yeah, you're right, because actually only people do work. And I want to tell a little story, and this is from a book that I would recommend people read if they have the time. It's a book called Maverick about this company in Brazil. And this guy, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but basically he inherits a company from his father and fires all the executives and has this big adventure and then turns everything into democracy and gets incredible results. But one of the things that he talks about is the sense of purpose, and he uses this metaphor, which I really like, and I think it relates to some of the stuff we do. So no one would ever say that stone cutting doesn't work, right? And he tells this story of the 3 stone cutters. And the first stone cutter is asked, what do you do? And he responds, I am paid to cut stones. Right? I'm paid to be a sysadmin. And the second one says, I use special configuration management to make all my servers do what I want them to do. And it's awesome. And the third one says, I build cathedrals. So just a different level of understanding of how we're contributing. All right, now what? Have you ever belonged to a team where everyone shared a purpose, where everyone was skilled, trusted, where everyone was empowered, where everyone constantly improves? Are you on that team right now? If you've ever had this experience, you long for it if you don't have it. Can you build that team right now? So DevOps is a word, continuous delivery words. And I think people need to stop conflating learning with academics. Stop conflating learning with training. I tried to explain some of these ideas before, and someone's like, so what we need is a training program. No. Stop conflating learning with education. There is no school. The organizations, this is an assertion, but I believe it's true. The organizations that build the future are basically going to have to teach themselves to do what they need to do that. And I think you already see that if you're looking at what's going on at Google, if you're seeing what's going on at Amazon. That is what has been happening, and that is only accelerating. So if you want to be good, you got to learn to be better every single day at everything you do. And at the point where you find problems that no one else is solving, there's no one that's coming from a graduate program that's going to fix those for you. You got to figure it out. And that requires a lot of other things we're talking about. So going back to the learning organization, this is basically a definition coming out of one of these papers. So the learning organization is one that has the capacity to integrate people and structures in order to move toward continuous learning and change. How did we forget about this stuff, man? So learning cannot be something that happens outside of the process. Learning is the point of the process. Continuous learning. Even if you are looking at what's going on when people talk about continuous delivery, lean startup, it's all about learning, but it's not. I don't think it's been made as explicit as it could be and as it should be. Cultivate sharing. Cultivate individuals. And so this is supported by research that learning organizations not only have the advantage of the increased capacity of cultivated talents, but they also have advantages attracting and retaining talent. Boom. All right, so we'll go on, close it down. This is an amazing time. Software is eating the world. Who's heard this? Who knows who said that? Mark Andreessen. So this is an assertion. You're either building a software business. This is related. This is Adam Jacobs' point of Adam Jacobs' talk, basically, velocity. You're either building a software business, or you're losing to someone who is. Right? This is obvious. We're going to kick it up a notch. You're either building a learning organization, or you'll be losing to someone who is. So I read this, Kate posted this link about the Harvard Business Review, about how we could reframe this ways to like identify and search for talent. And I don't actually think, obviously there are things you can search for, but I don't think talent is primarily a search problem. I think that's the wrong way to frame it. I think the talent is there. And especially when you start, I don't want to get too deep into a bunch of these other issues, but when you look at the way this industry is dominated by kind of normative archetypes, we'll say, I think there's a ton of underutilized talent that's like right there in front of us, and we're too busy like arguing that over like whether we could find the right guy from like whatever experience instead of like taking a smart person and like showing them how to do it. People just need purpose. Build cathedrals. People just need the environment to grow. And I'm going to say this, success is not about finding the right people. Success is about being the right people. If someone asks me what I do, I build the future. Build the future. The game has changed. And I have 4 minutes for questions. And I have also resources and bonus material. But let's see if there's questions. What you got? Come on, Mike. Help me out. I thought you were never at loss for words.
Only with you.
Oh, come on now.
Need at least 2 beers before. I got one.
Okay.
So, talk about learning organizations, but people have to have a desire to learn as well in those organizations. Right? You can't just take somebody who doesn't really want to learn, they just want to do what they're doing, and always, successfully integrate into that. So what I'm asking is, how do you get people to think more about learning? How do you stop them from just...
You give them a cathedral that they want to build. And then I would also argue that we have intrinsic desire to learn, and that when you're running into people that are in that state, it's because they've reached a Nash equilibrium with the way the rest of their career has gone, that they don't see some combination of what's going on at home, at work, or maybe they're learning some other thing outside of work. Maybe that's not their cathedral. And so figuring out a way to connect to that intrinsic motive to learn is the solution to this problem. That's my opinion. Yes, sir.
Sorry, this one's academic. And what you're saying is beautiful, and I love it.
Okay.
How do you correct for people who are lower on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and believe in the Pareto inefficiency?
How do you correct for the people who are lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and correct for the Pareto inefficiency? So I think there's a few ways that you can do that. Obviously, we as individuals with limited resources, there's certain things that, because of the way that the systemic rules of the game are set up, that we as individuals have a limited ability to impact. But for an individual who is, I think it's incorrect to assume that because someone is lower in fulfilling different aspects of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that they're not concerned with the higher ones. And then figuring out ways to fill the lower ones actually tends to be easier than filling the higher ones. If you can give someone, so at lunch we were talking to is it Par Scholes? I can't remember how to pronounce it. Per Scholes. They are taking people, and it's a nonprofit that takes people and puts them through a 15-week program and teaches them how to do some software testing, and they go from basically making $9,000 a year to, on average, making 27, I believe is what the guy said at lunch. So that's, I believe, directly addressing this sort of lower level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and helping them provide some of this stuff that they wouldn't be able to with $9,000 a year. Mike.
So you talk about organizational learning. What's the first step an organization should take, or what resources should they look for in order to create this kind of change?
So if you ask me any question, I'm usually going to say it depends, because you have a context. So when you say the first thing that someone should do, I believe that, going back to I like the OODA loop, but there's a lot of other models, is you should orient yourself. Figure out where we are, right? Figure out where we are on the dimensions of learning. Don't take actions until you actually have oriented yourself. That's what I would do. So the first step is figure out where you are. Does that make sense? I think I'm at my hard stop. Do you want me to keep going, or does anyone else have any more questions? There are manners of work and manners of planning work such that at the end of the project, you are better at your job than when you started. And I think that anyone who's been in a team that works like that, when you see over time, like there's certain people where they say, oh, he worked for this company, and so they're good. And it's not necessarily that those people were smarter than other people that went into another company, but the manner of working actually creates talent or develops talent. And there's a lot of ideas. I think some of the stuff that happens at Etsy, the chat ops, a lot of these things, when you're doing the chat ops and everyone's like dumping everything into one thing, so if anyone does anything, not only do you know, but you know how to do it for next time, like that's helping you evolve. And when you see something you don't know, you're like, what is that thing? Oh, there's 5 people in the chat room that tell you. That changes it, right? Instead of you being alone by yourself going, how do I do this weird thing on this weird network device that I hardly ever deal with, and like Googling and fumbling, it's like, oh, the senior dude just did it in the chat ops. I know that now for next time. Thank you.